Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a staggering 50-year history of Bangladesh to explore a really provocative question. What if systemic corruption isn't just, a random string of individual crimes, but an actual, deeply embedded survival mechanism for politicians? We are going to look at a system where patronage, kleptocracy, and essentially the commodification of public office became the absolute primary mechanisms for political survival in a post-colonial state. Okay, so let's define this concept right off the bat. The dirty mind being discussed here isn't just some personal moral feeling. It's framed as a very specific psychological condition, one that's deeply rooted in post-colonial history and the trauma of the 1971 Liberation War. Because think about it, in a highly volatile, deeply insecure political landscape, trust is incredibly scarce. So the default assumption for anyone in power shifts to this zero-sum worldview. In that kind of environment, navigating opaque networks and handing out favors that isn't seen as corrupt, it's actually valorized as political competence. The dirty mind is that cognitive shift where public office isn't viewed as serving the common good anymore, but strictly as a private enterprise for wealth accumulation. And this creates a totally vicious, self-perpetuating cycle. It always starts with psychological insecurity, leaders feeling like their rule is perpetually under threat. That survivalist instinct mutates into actively co-opting state institutions, which is the dirty politics phase. Once those institutions are compromised, well, the boundary between public interest and private gain is just completely erased. And finally, because the state literally can no longer absorb shocks or serve its people, boom, you get systemic crisis and massive volatility. Here's a roadmap for the explainer. We'll start with the theory of the dirty mind, move from liberation to autocracy, examine the bipolar polarization, the era of systemic erosion, the collapse of institutions, and finally, look at reform versus continued stagnation. Section 1. The theory of the dirty mind, a structural imperative for post-colonial power. Just think about how wild this idea is for a second. In a highly fragmented landscape, having integrity actually puts you at a massive disadvantage. It's a system where the cognitive dissonance required to hold on to power means you basically have to compartmentalize your morality. Actions that we would normally call corrupt are just recategorized as necessary pragmatism or political realism. The dirtiness isn't a glitch. It's a completely adaptive, performative part of leadership used to hold fragile coalitions together. Section 2. From liberation to autocracy, tracing the seeds of dysfunction. So, tracing this historically, the crucial pivot point is the transition from Sheikh Mujibur Rahman's centralization to Hussein Mohammad Ershad's calculated autocracy. The devastating 1974 famine really exposed how fragile the new state was, and in response to internal dissent and this growing siege mentality, Mujib transitioned the country into a one-party state, BAKSAL, in 1975, effectively stifling political competition before he was tragically assassinated. Fast forward to 1982, Ershad initiates a military coup, kicking off an era of bureaucratic autocracy. To fracture the opposition and lock down his base, Ershad even amended the constitution in 1988 to make Islam the state religion, a move that very cynically blurred the lines between civic citizenship and religious affiliation. By the time we hit the 1980s under Ershad, the symptoms had completely metastasized. The state was being actively repurposed to serve a ruling clique. You had a meritocratic civil service totally eroded, where promotion suddenly became entirely contingent on party loyalty. Judges were facing executive threats, and state-owned enterprises were privatized in ways that explicitly favored regime insiders. What we're witnessing here is the fundamental redefinition of a public servant into a private broker. Section 3. The bipolar polarization from 1990 to 2006, the zero-sum warfare of the duopoly. Now, it's absolutely fascinating to look at the distinct tactical playbooks of the two main political factions during this era. On one hand, the Awami League leaned heavily into the moral capital of the 1971 Liberation War. They cultivated this narrative where the opposition wasn't just disagreeing with them, they were framed as an existential threat to national identity itself. Conversely, the legacy of the Jatiya Party, which really heavily influenced the BNP strategies, relied much more on pragmatic patronage and bureaucratic coercion. So you have one side seeking to monopolize the moral meaning of the state, while the other sought to monopolize the actual administrative mechanisms of the state. But the ultimate tragedy of this era? Both sides eventually just ended up adopting each other's worst practices. The whole political arena devolved into zero-sum warfare. Vital safeguards, like the caretaker government system that was literally meant to oversee neutral elections, were dismantled. State resources were weaponized, and the very concept of a shared national interest was completely swallowed up by partisan loyalty. Section 4. The era of systemic erosion from 2009 to the present. Legalistic authoritarianism. During this recent era, to maintain legitimacy while still centralizing power, the regime aggressively promoted the Bangladesh model of economic growth. And this model relied heavily on three things: ready-made garments, overseas remittances, and debt-financed mega-infrastructure projects. But honestly, this impressive macroeconomic growth was essentially acting as a mask. Right behind it lay a deeply institutionalized crony capitalism, where regulatory frameworks were only selectively enforced to benefit highly connected business conglomerates. Ultimately, constantly prioritizing regime survival and patronage over genuine long-term institutional building, it created an incredibly fragile state. The system just became so rigid, so incapable of absorbing shocks or engaging in actual dialogue that it tragically ruptured. And we saw that during the massive public uprising led by students and civil society in July 2024. Section 5. The collapse of institutions. How the psychology of power dismantled the state. If we break down the structure, you can see total state capture across three fundamental pillars of society. The judiciary, thanks to biased appointments, engaged in selective justice, turning into a weapon for political silencing. The media faced extreme polarization through the Digital Security Act and corporate capture, essentially turning the Fourth Estate into state propaganda. And elections, manipulated by a compromised election commission, they transformed from actual accountability mechanisms into predetermined hollow rituals. It's literally a feedback loop of systemic dysfunction. Section 6. Reform or continued stagnation. The stark choice for the next 50 years. So, how do we dismantle this architecture? The analysis points to some pretty severe, uncompromising remedies. First, entirely decoupling economic opportunity from political loyalty. Basically, ending crony capitalism. It demands totally overhauling the civil service back into an independent meritocratic body. It requires independent oversight bodies that actually have prosecutorial teeth. And perhaps most crucially, a cultural shift in civic education to reject the normalization of corruption. We have to break the fatalism that bribery is just the normal cost of doing business. Which leaves us with a pretty massive, provocative question to ponder. If the political survival of the elite literally relies on the exact corruption that holds the whole nation back, can this deeply ingrained psychology truly be rewritten? It's the ultimate test of agency for the next generation. Do they have what it takes to break this 50-year cycle of dirty politics and finally realize the nation's immense, untapped potential?